There is a moment in Singin' in the Rain, one of the most famous moments in the history of American film, where Gene Kelly walks out into a downpour and starts to dance. He swings around a lamppost, splashes through puddles, grins at strangers passing under their umbrellas. The whole sequence radiates a kind of impossible, uncomplicated joy. It is one of the great performances of exuberance ever put on film, and it was shot by a man running a fever of 103 degrees, dancing in a tank of water mixed with milk so it would show up better on camera, in a suit that had to be dried and re-soaked between takes. Gene Kelly spent his professional life making the extraordinary look effortless. His personal life was something else entirely. 3 marriages, each shaped by the particular pressures of who he was and the world he lived in, each carrying its own weight of ambition, longing, and loss. The dancing in the rain was the performance. What follows is the rest of the story. The man before the marriages, Eugene Curran Kelly, was born on August 23, 1912, in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The third of 5 children in an Irish Catholic family that was working class in the most earnest sense of the phrase. His father, James Patrick Kelly, worked as a phonograph salesman. His mother, Harriet, was the organizing force of the household, a woman of considerable determination who had strong opinions about what her children should become and was not shy about expressing them. She enrolled young Gene in dancing school when he was 8 years old. He hated it. He was a boy in a working-class Pittsburgh neighborhood in the early 1920s, and dancing lessons were not exactly a badge of social status in that context. He endured years of being teased for it, and he responded to the teasing the way he responded to most opposition throughout his life, by getting better, by working harder, by turning what was being used against him into something nobody could argue with. By his early teens, he had stopped hating dancing. He had started loving it in the way that people love things they discover they are genuinely, extraordinarily good at. He and his brother Fred performed together at local events, at clubs, at any venue that would have them. He was earning money from performing before he was old enough to drive. He attended Pennsylvania State University, began studying economics, then transferred to the University of Pittsburgh. The Depression was happening around him, and the practical realities of his family's situation meant that earning money was not an abstract concern. He taught dance lessons, sometimes to as many as several hundred students, to help support the family during some of its toughest years. He opened a dance studio in Pittsburgh with his brother Fred. He was, in his early 20s, a working teacher as well as a developing performer. What drove him toward New York, and eventually toward Broadway and then Hollywood, was not simply ambition in the conventional sense. It was the specific hunger of someone who had identified exactly what they were built to do and who was not going to be satisfied doing anything else. He arrived in New York in the late 1930s, found work in the chorus of shows, moved up steadily, and landed the role that changed everything. Pal Joey in Rogers and Hart's musical of the same name, which opened on Broadway on December 25th, 1940. Pal Joey made him. The character was a heel, a charming, manipulative nightclub dancer who used the people around him for his own ends. It was not a sympathetic role, and it required Kelly to project a kind of charisma that worked even when the character's behavior was at its worst. He pulled it off completely. The reviews were extraordinary. Hollywood came calling almost immediately. He arrived in Los Angeles in 1941 under contract to David O. Selznick, who promptly loaned him to MGM. The deal led to For Me and My Gal in 1942, opposite Judy Garland. From there, the career built quickly. Covergirl with Rita Hayworth in 1944. Anchors Away in 1945. Ziegfeld Follies in 1946. And then, as the decade closed, the string of films that established him permanently in the American cultural imagination. What Kelly brought to film that was genuinely new was a physical vocabulary that had not been seen before. Fred Astaire, the figure he was most often compared to, and with whom he shared the distinction of being one of the two greatest dancer performers in Hollywood history, worked in a mode that was elegant, refined, aristocratic. Kelly's mode was different. He was athletic, where Astaire was graceful, earthy, where Astaire was elevated. His movement came from the ground up, had weight to it, made you aware of the physical effort behind the apparent ease in a way that Astaire's did not. It was a different argument about what dancing could be, and audiences responded to it with enormous enthusiasm. He was also, from early in his Hollywood career, someone who thought seriously about what the movie musical could do as a form. He was not content to simply perform numbers that had been choreographed by others. He wanted control over the creative process, wanted to design the movement, wanted the dance sequences to advance the story rather than simply interrupt it. He fought for this control and, as his stature grew, increasingly obtained it. But by the time he arrived in Hollywood, he had already met the woman he would marry first. And that marriage, the one that lasted the longest and cost the most, in the end, had already begun to take shape. Marriage. 1. Betsy Blair. Betsy Blair was 18 years old when she met Gene Kelly. He was 26. The year was 1940, just before Pal Joey opened, and she was a teenager who had been dancing at a New York nightclub called Diamond Horseshoe. Not as a headliner, but as a member of the chorus line, young and striking and clearly talented in ways that had not yet found their proper outlet. Kelly noticed her immediately. What followed was the kind of courtship that happens when two people who are both intensely driven and not particularly patient decide they want to be together. Quick, certain, and conducted at the pace of people who do not see any reason to slow down. He was on the verge of Broadway stardom. She was 19 and had not yet decided exactly what she was going to become. What they recognized in each other, in those early months, was something simpler than any of that. A mutual seriousness, a shared unwillingness to be ordinary, a compatibility that felt real enough to build a life on. They married on September 26th, 1941. She was 19. He was 28. The marriage began in New York, but relocated almost immediately to Los Angeles as Kelly's film career accelerated. They moved into a house in Beverly Hills that would become, across the following decade, one of the gathering points for a particular kind of Hollywood intellectual social life. Writers, directors, actors, and political thinkers who were drawn to Kelly's specific combination of working-class roots, genuine artistic seriousness, and strong progressive political convictions. Kelly was not simply a dancer who happened to be famous. He was someone with genuine intellectual interests in art, in film theory, in politics. He had strong opinions about what popular entertainment could and should be, about the relationship between art and audience, about the social responsibilities of public figures. His household reflected these interests. The dinner parties at the Kelly home in Beverly Hills were, by the accounts of people who attended them, genuinely lively. Conversations about politics and film and the state of the world that ran late into the night. Betsy Blair, as she grew into her 20s, developed her own serious artistic identity. She was building a film career, smaller roles initially, but she was working, and she was developing into an actress of genuine quality. Her politics were, if anything, further left than her husband's, and in the political climate of the late 1940s, that was a fact that would matter enormously. Their daughter, Kerry Kelly, was born on October 16th, 1942. She was the couple's only child, and by all accounts, Gene Kelly was a devoted and genuinely present father, something that is worth noting because it was not universal among men of his professional stature in that era, men whose careers consumed most of their waking hours and who left the business of child-rearing entirely to their wives. The professional partnership between Kelly and his most important collaborator, the director Stanley Donen, was also consolidating during these years. Together, they co-directed On the Town in 1949 and Singin' in the Rain in 1952, two of the finest American musicals ever made. Kelly was, by the early 1950s, at the absolute peak of his craft. Someone who was simultaneously the most important choreographer in Hollywood film, one of its most bankable stars, and a genuine creative force who was reshaping what film musicals could do. Between those two films came An American in Paris in 1951, directed by Vincente Minnelli and produced by Arthur Freed. The film won 6 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. The 17-minute ballet sequence that closes it, a sustained piece of dance storytelling set against backdrops inspired by French Impressionist painters, was unlike anything that had been attempted in a Hollywood musical before. It was Kelly's vision, fought for against studio executives who thought it was too long, too expensive, and too experimental for a mainstream audience. He was right, and they were wrong, and the sequence remains one of the most ambitious things he ever did. Singin' in the Rain, which followed the year after, is the film he is most associated with in the popular memory. Its title number, 3 minutes of Kelly dancing in a manufactured rainstorm, was shot in 3 days, with Kelly running a fever throughout. The decision to mix milk into the water in the tank to make it show up better on camera meant that he was dancing in a substance that soaked through his suit with a particular thoroughness. He did it anyway, as many times as it required, until it was right. It is the most famous thing he ever did, and he did it sick and cold, and with the entire weight of a major studio production resting on every take. This was the productive context of the marriage to Betsy Blair. But under the surface, things were considerably more complicated. The post-war years brought the Red Scare and the House Un-American Activities Committee to Hollywood, with a force that reorganized the entire social and professional landscape of the film industry. The blacklist, the practice of refusing to hire people suspected of communist sympathies or associations, destroyed careers, ended friendships, and placed enormous pressure on everyone who had ever held progressive political views or associated with people who had. Betsy Blair was investigated for her political associations. She was not blacklisted in the formal sense, but the pressure on her career was real, and the studios were not eager to employ her. Kelly used his standing, considerable by this point, to intervene on her behalf. When MGM was reluctant to cast her in Marty in 1955, Kelly went to Harry Cohn at Columbia Pictures and used his leverage to push for her. She got the part, delivered a performance that was widely praised, and was nominated for an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actress. That Kelly fought for his wife's career in this way says something genuinely decent about him. But it also captures something about the nature of their relationship by the mid-1950s, an asymmetry of professional power that had been present since the beginning and that the political climate had made more pronounced. She was the one whose career was threatened, and he was the one with enough standing to protect it. The dynamic of who needed protecting and who did the protecting is never an entirely comfortable one in a marriage, however generously it is managed. The marriage had been under strain for some time before the end arrived. What exactly caused the final deterioration is a matter that both parties handled with considerable privacy. Neither Kelly nor Blair were people who found the airing of personal grievances in public to be a natural or comfortable impulse. What is documented is that they separated and that the divorce was finalized in 1957. They had been married for 16 years. Kerry was 14. Betsy Blair went on to a distinguished career in European cinema after the marriage ended, working with some of the finest directors in France and Italy. She married again, Carol Rice, the British film director, and lived a life that was, by her own accounts, full and meaningful. She died in 2009. What Kelly felt about the end of the marriage, in private, he kept private. What people who knew him in the period immediately following the divorce observed was a man who threw himself into work with even greater intensity than before, which, given his baseline level of intensity, was saying something. The years after Betsy Blair would be quieter on the personal front for a while, but they would not stay quiet. And the next chapter of his life would be shaped not by a gradual courtship, but by something considerably more impulsive. The years between. The period between Kelly's first and second marriages, roughly 1957 to 1960, was not a period of withdrawal or diminished output. He continued to work, continued to direct, continued to be one of the most prominent figures in American entertainment. But Singin' in the Rain had been made in 1952, and the form of the movie musical it exemplified. The big, ambitious, studio-produced musical that required the kind of resources and creative infrastructure that MGM had once provided almost without thinking, was becoming harder to sustain as the studio system itself began to change. Television was eating into cinema audiences. The great integrated musicals that Kelly had helped create were becoming economically difficult to justify. He adapted, as he always had, by expanding his range, directing, television work, projects that were different from anything he had done before. He directed Tunnel of Love in 1958 and Gigot in 1962. He appeared in Les Girls in 1957, one of his last major film musicals. He was never idle, and he was never professionally lost in the way that some performers of his generation were during this period of transition. What the late 1950s also gave him was time in Europe. He spent extended periods in France, a country he had always loved and that had always loved him in return. The French cultural establishment took the movie musical seriously in ways that the American critical world often did not, and Kelly was admired there with an intensity that was genuinely sustaining during a period when the Hollywood landscape was changing around him in ways that were not entirely to his advantage. But he was also, in his mid to late 40s, a man who had spent 20 years of his adult life as part of a household and who found living alone considerably less congenial than his professional confidence might have suggested. He was social by nature. He needed the texture of domestic life around him, even when his work was consuming most of his attention. The woman who would become his second wife came into his life in circumstances that were, by comparison with the measured beginnings of his first marriage, considerably more spontaneous. What that spontaneity produced was a marriage that surprised almost everyone who knew him and that would not survive long, though the depth of his feeling for the person involved was, by all accounts, entirely genuine. Marriage 2. Jean Coyne. Jan Coyne was not a stranger to Gene Kelly when they married in 1960. She was, in fact, someone who had been part of his professional world for years. A dancer and dance assistant who had worked alongside him for much of the 1950s. Someone whose talent he respected and whose presence in the professional landscape of his career was long established. She had, moreover, previously been married to Stanley Donen, Kelly's closest collaborator, the man who had co-directed his two greatest films. The overlap of personal and professional worlds in this story was intricate even by Hollywood standards. Donen and Kelly had navigated the creative partnership with the full knowledge that they were working in each other's personal orbits, which added its own layer of complexity to a professional relationship that was already intense. Jan had been part of the dance community in Hollywood for years, a serious, skilled professional who was known and respected by the people who made the best musicals of the era. She was not famous in the way that the stars around her were famous, but she was genuinely accomplished, and the people who worked with her consistently spoke about her with warmth and regard. Their marriage, on August 6th, 1960, was relatively quiet. No large public ceremony, no elaborate production. Kelly was 47. Jan was 36. It was the marriage of two adults who knew each other well and who had decided, without particular fanfare, to make their partnership official. What neither of them knew at the time of the wedding, or if they knew they did not yet fully understand the implications, was that Jeanne was already ill. She had leukemia. The diagnosis came not long after the marriage, and what followed was a period defined by the particular kind of love that expresses itself primarily through presence, through simply being there, through organizing one's life around the needs of someone who is losing their health. They had two children together in rapid succession. Timothy was born in 1962 and Bridget in 1964. Both births happened during a period when Jeanne's health was deteriorating, and the experience of new parenthood layered over the reality of a serious illness created a household of extraordinary emotional complexity, joy and grief occupying the same rooms, sometimes at the same time. Kelly was, by all accounts, devoted to Jeanne in a way that went considerably beyond what duty or social expectation would have required. He reorganized his professional life to be present at home. He took on fewer projects, turned down opportunities that would have taken him away for extended periods, and oriented his daily existence around the family they were building together, even as the shadow over it grew darker. What this cost him professionally is difficult to measure precisely, but it is worth noting. He was in his late 40s and early 50s during this period, years that, for many directors and choreographers, represent a peak of creative authority and capability. He worked, and he continued to work well, but the sustained dedication to major projects that had characterized the first half of his career was, during the years of Jeanne's illness, necessarily curtailed. He chose his family over his career in a period when those two things could not coexist at full intensity simultaneously, and he made that choice without apparent regret. Jeanne Coyne Kelly died on May 10th, 1973. She was 48 years old. She and Jean had been married for 13 years. The death of a spouse from a long illness is a particular kind of grief. Not the shock of sudden loss, but something that has been approaching for years, something you have watched coming and done everything possible to slow until the moment arrives, and all the preparation turns out to have prepared you for nothing much at all. Kelly had two young children. Timothy was 11, Bridget was 9. He was 60 years old. He had been, by this point, through a 16-year marriage and a 13-year marriage, had experienced the particular kinds of loss each brought with it, and was now a widower raising two children alone. He did not collapse. He was not, constitutionally, a person who collapsed. He kept working. He kept being present for his children. He kept dancing, in the limited ways that aging allows, and teaching, and directing, and being the person that his professional reputation required him to be in public contexts. But the people who knew him in the years after Jan's death described someone who was quieter than he had been, not broken, but changed in the way that cumulative loss changes people, permanently and without fanfare. The fire was still there, the intelligence, the drive, the opinions. But something had gone out that had been lit by the specific warmth of having a family around him. And the house in Beverly Hills was a different kind of place without Jan in it. He would be a widower for more than 10 years before he married again. What happened in those years? How he raised his children, how he kept working, how he processed what he had been through, is a chapter of his life that does not appear in many accounts because it was not dramatically eventful in the way that Hollywood stories are supposed to be. It was simply a man living with his losses and doing his best. And then, in his 70s, he fell in love one more time. Marriage. 3. Patricia Ward. Patricia Ward was 31 years old when she married Gene Kelly on August 15, 1990. He was 77. The age difference, 46 years, was the subject of considerable comment when the marriage became public. People who wrote about it did not always write about it kindly. The coverage had a tone that ranged from skeptical to outright dismissive, the assumption being that what was happening between an elderly legend and a much younger woman could not possibly be what it appeared to be. Those who knew them disagreed, often pointedly. She was a researcher and writer, not a performer, not someone whose own career existed in the same universe as Kelly's. She had met him in the mid-1980s, during a period when Kelly was doing the kind of work that older entertainers do: retrospectives, interviews, appearances at events honoring his career and the era it represented. She was present in a professional capacity initially, working with him on documentation of his life and work, and the relationship that developed from that beginning was gradual and, by the accounts of people who observed it closely, entirely genuine. Kelly had not been looking for a third marriage. He had raised his 2 children largely on his own through the 1970s and into the 1980s. He had not been without companionship during those years. He was Gene Kelly, and the suggestion that he spent 2 decades in complete solitude would not be accurate. But he had not married, had not seemed to be in any particular hurry to marry, and was, by the time he met Patricia Ward, someone who had organized his life into a workable shape that did not obviously require transformation. What Patricia Ward brought to that life, by the accounts of people who knew them together, was genuine. She was attentive to him in ways that mattered, not as a caretaker, not in the manner of someone performing a role, but as a partner who was genuinely interested in who he was, beyond the famous person. She was younger enough to have grown up watching him, to have known him first as the man on the screen rather than as a peer. And there was something in that, both complicated and simple, about what she brought to the relationship. His children's reactions to the marriage were mixed in the way that adult children's reactions to a surviving parent's remarriage are usually mixed. Kerry, his daughter from his first marriage, was in her late 40s by the time of the wedding. Timothy and Bridget, the children from his marriage to Jan Coyne, were 27 and 25 respectively. They had grown up watching their father grieve their mother. The arrival of a new person in a spousal role, decades after that grief, is not a simple thing to accommodate, even when it is clearly making the parent in question happy. And Kelly was, by the accounts of those who saw him in the early years of the marriage to Patricia Ward, happy in ways he had not been for some time. He was still working, consulting on productions, giving interviews, being Gene Kelly in the way that the entertainment industry periodically requires its legends to be Gene Kelly. But he was also, more consistently than before, simply at home, present, at ease in a household that had warmth in it again. He had his first stroke in 1994. He recovered, but the recovery was not complete, and the experience of a body that had been, throughout his entire life, one of his primary instruments beginning to fail him in serious ways, was something he found deeply difficult. He had always been physical, had defined himself through physical precision, through the extraordinary things his body could do when he asked it to. The loss of that precision, gradual and then more sudden after 1994, was not an abstract diminishment. It was the removal of something central to his identity. Kelly had, in the decades following his major film work, continued to speak publicly about dance, about what it was, what it required, what it could communicate. He gave lectures. He participated in documentaries. He was articulate about his craft in the way that not all great performers are, able to describe from the inside what the movement felt like and what he was trying to achieve with it. Losing the ability to demonstrate, to simply stand up and show what he meant, was, for him, a particular kind of loss that went beyond the physical. Patricia Ward Kelly was with him through all of this. She managed his care, his affairs, his public presence, the things that needed managing for someone whose mind was still largely present, but whose body was increasingly unreliable. People who observed her in this role describe someone doing it without resentment, without performance, and without any of the complicated motivations that the cynical reading of a 46-year age gap might suggest. Gene Kelly suffered a second stroke in 1996, from which he did not recover. He died on February 2nd, 1996, at his home in Beverly Hills. He was 83 years old. Patricia Ward Kelly was 42. She stayed. After his death, she became the primary guardian of his legacy, managing his estate, his archive, his image. She has spoken about him in interviews over the years with a specificity and a warmth that are hard to dismiss as performance. She has described what their life together was actually like, the ordinary daily texture of it, in terms that suggest she knew him better than most people who wrote about him ever did. What 3 marriages look like from the outside. Looking at Gene Kelly's 3 marriages from a distance, what you see is 3 very different kinds of love at 3 very different stages of a life. The marriage to Betsy Blair was the marriage of 2 young, driven, politically serious people who grew up and grew apart in the particular furnace of post-war Hollywood. It lasted 16 years and produced a daughter and a body of shared experience that both of them carried for the rest of their lives. It ended, as many long marriages end, not with a single dramatic rupture, but with the accumulated weight of difference, in need, in direction, in what each of them had become. The political pressures of the Red Scare era were real forces in their lives and in their household, and the way those pressures played out, with Kelly's career shielded and Blair's threatened, shaped the dynamic between them in ways that were not always easy to navigate. The marriage to Jan Coyne was the marriage of a man in his late 40s and a woman in her mid-30s who had chosen each other with the full knowledge of who the other person was, and who then had the terrible luck to have illness arrive so close to the beginning. What Kelly gave to that marriage, the devotion, the reorganized professional life, the presence through 13 years of declining health, and then the solo parenting of 2 young children after Jean's death, is the part of his story that tends to get the least attention, because it does not have the glamour of the dance numbers or the drama of the political years. It is simply a man taking care of the people he loved. It is not nothing. It is, in fact, the hardest thing. The marriage to Patricia Ward was the marriage that people wrote about in the easiest, most dismissive terms. The old man and the young woman, the legend and the researcher, the obvious imbalance of age and fame. What those accounts miss, almost universally, is the quality of what was actually there. 2 people who found in each other something they had not found elsewhere. A household that was, by the testimony of those who knew it, warm and real and sustaining for both of them. Gene Kelly was not a simple person. The public image, the grin, the athleticism, the infectious on-screen joy was real, but it was also a surface. Underneath it was someone who had grown up poor in Pittsburgh, who had worked relentlessly to build something extraordinary from nothing, who held his feelings with considerable tightness in private, while giving everything in performance. He was, by the accounts of his collaborators, demanding to work with. Not cruel, but exacting in the way that people are when their standards are very high, and they cannot quite lower them even when it would be easier for everyone. He was also someone who kept trying, in each marriage, to build the same thing: a home, in the fullest sense, a place where the performance could stop, a life that was not only about the work, however magnificent the work was. He found it, imperfectly and at cost, in each of the three, and the losses embedded in each: the long dissolution of the first, the slow grief of the second, the strokes and the diminishment of the third, were all losses that he absorbed and kept moving through, because that was what he had always done. He had been absorbing opposition and difficulty and the judgment of people who underestimated him since he was 8 years old in a Pittsburgh dance school, being laughed at for something he loved. He kept going. He kept dancing for as long as his body would let him. He kept making things, kept directing, kept being present in the rooms where the work happened. And then he stopped, on a February morning in 1996, in the house in Beverly Hills, where so much of his life had been lived, with his third wife beside him. What remains? Gene Kelly died, having made some of the most joyful films in the history of American cinema: Singin' in the Rain, An American in Paris, On the Town, Anchors Away. These are not films that merely entertain. They are arguments, made in movement, for the idea that human beings are capable of beauty on a scale that exceeds what ordinary life typically allows. He did not have an easy life. The three marriages each carried their own difficulty: the political pressures that shadowed the first, the illness that ran through the second like a thread of darkness, the age difference and health decline that defined the third. He was not always an easy person to be close to. He asked a great deal of the people in his orbit because he asked a great deal of himself, and the two things are not easy to separate. People who worked with him in the choreography room described someone who would run a sequence until it was right, regardless of how many times that required, who had a precise internal image of what he was after, and would not accept anything short of it. The same quality that made his work great made ordinary daily life with him, at times, demanding. What Kelly understood, and what his best work embodies, is that the relationship between difficulty and beauty is not always oppositional. Sometimes the difficulty is what makes the beauty possible. Not because suffering is instructive in some pat, fortune cookie sense, but because the people who have absorbed the most have sometimes the most to give when the camera rolls or the spotlight finds them. The rain sequence in Singin' in the Rain was shot over 3 days in 1951. The tank was cold. The suit was soaked. The fever was real. He danced it anyway, with a precision and a joy that 7 decades later makes people smile before they know they are smiling. That is the thing about Gene Kelly that no account of his personal difficulties fully cancels. Whatever was hard, and plenty was hard, he made the dancing look like the easiest, most natural thing in the world. He made it look like the only possible response to being alive. The boy from Pittsburgh, who had been mocked for taking dance lessons, became the man who redefined what the American movie musical could do. The 3 marriages, the losses within them, the years alone between the second and the third, none of it showed up in the dancing. Or rather, all of it showed up in the dancing, in the way that everything a person has lived shows up eventually in the thing they do best, transformed by the act of doing it into something that an audience receives as pure, unmediated feeling. For a man who experienced the losses he experienced and carried them the way he carried them, that was not nothing. It was, in fact, everything. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.